Good afternoon, everyone. To those of you here in the room and those of you tuning in online, my name is Lauren Reese, and it's together with my colleagues in the Environmental Security Program, it's my privilege to welcome you to the Stimson Center. For those of you joining us for the first time, Stimson is a nonpartisan think tank that advances international security through research, policy innovation, and close collaboration with communities and countries around the world. Our environmental security program helps decision makers unpack complex risks at the intersection of environment, health, population, and security. The focus of today's event, Antarctica at the Crossroads, sits at this intersection of issues in a unique, important, but often overlooked way. Before joining Stimson, I led the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center, where I worked closely with colleagues in the Polar Institute, including Mike Sbrega, Becca Pincus, and Evan Bloom, one of today's panelists. It didn't matter that my work was more focused on developing countries across sub-Saharan Africa or climate-vulnerable countries in Latin America or the Middle East. Time and time again, I would find myself in the same room as Mike, Becca, and Evan because what was happening in the Arctic and Antarctic could not be isolated from what was happening elsewhere in the world. One of our other panelists, Benjamin Gadan, was also in those rooms as director of the Latin America program at the Wilson Center. Incidentally, so we live on this planet, right, where weather systems, polar dynamics, and ocean currents underpin our daily experience and existence. The rapidly changing environment in Antarctica and more broadly across the poles has profound implications for multilateral governance, security, and human well-being. These changes are not distinct or abstract. They are shaping how communities are already experiencing and will continue to experience climate change. In some places, these connections are being felt more acutely today. Just yesterday morning, I was in Aruba with our senior advisor, Sally Yozel, to launch a new climate risk assessment of the island. The core of the assessment examines the ecological, economic, and social vulnerabilities in a given place to help decision makers understand how climate risks are likely to play out in that specific context. One of the key concerns that was raised by stakeholders in Aruba was sea level rise, and for good reason. Aruba's economy is heavily dependent on tourism. Most of its critical infrastructure is located on the coastline, and hotels have replaced mangroves, one of the island's most effective natural defenses. The issue feels even more urgent in light of new research published just last week in Nature Geoscience. Scientists found that more than 5 miles of glacial ice in Antarctica vanished in only 2 months. That's 10 times faster than the previous record. And I feel like this is a constant theme, right? It's like record-breaking every week. The study focused on a relatively small glacier, but if this rapid retreat is a preview of what lies ahead for Antarctica's larger glaciers, sea level rise will accelerate beyond current projections. For Aruba and coastal communities around the world, the implications are immense. But this conversation is not just about risk. As we've seen time and time again, the environment can also be an entry point to cooperation and collaboration between communities, countries, and sectors. Through the Antarctic Treaty, Antarctica has emerged as a focal point that captures the intrinsic connections between environmental protection, scientific research and exploration, and cooperation among countries. So it is with great enthusiasm that I turn the panel discussion over to Dr. Mallette Mesfin. We are thrilled to have Mallette here as a non-resident fellow with our program. Mallette most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans, Fisheries, and Polar Affairs at the State Department, and as a senior advisor on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff. She previously led the Center for Science Diplomacy at AAAS and worked in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Mallette brings deep expertise in bridging science, policy, and diplomacy, exactly the kind of perspective needed to frame and lead today's discussion. So please join me in welcoming Mallette and our distinguished panelists. Mallette, thank you for pulling this conversation together.
Thank you, Lauren, for that introduction and teeing up the conversation for today. And thanks to all of you as well for being here virtually and in the room. We had quite a large response to this event, and I think that just speaks to the importance of the topic and I think the desire for more public conversation around it. There's been a lot of discussion about the Arctic for many reasons, but much less so on the southern pole. And it's often said that what happens in the Arctic stays in the Arctic. And I think that that applies to the southern pole as well. We know what a critical role Antarctica plays in helping to regulate global climate and ocean currents. We've already heard about sea level rise and the impact that's already having on communities and the potential for Antarctica to contribute to that on our globe. And so, the global community is continuing to learn much more about the world's highest, driest, coldest, windiest, most remote continent. But there's always been a recognition that it's a very unique place on this planet. And there was a time when that meant that there was a scramble for claims over the land because there were no human inhabitants of it. There was a time when that meant that scientists realized the urgency of trying to learn more, but lacked a framework for how to do that. And there was a time where there were deep concerns in the Cold War era around the tensions and mistrust spilling over into this ungoverned space. And so there was at a time when global tensions were high, 12 countries came together to create the Antarctic Treaty, which established really a foundation for the continent focused on peace, on science, on cooperation, on non-nuclearization, and created a multilateral system of governance. From that initial Antarctic Treaty, a whole system was created that helps to address other significant issues in the region. One of those is the Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR, which was signed in 1980, and we'll hear a lot more about that on the panel. Another was a protocol on environmental protection, also known as the Madrid Protocol, which was signed in 1991. And among other things, it prohibits activity related to mineral resources other than scientific research. So the treaty itself is an exceptional achievement. It's been a shining example of the world coming together in spite of conflicts in a time where we put science and collaboration ahead of politics. This current moment is one that's also marked by intense stress in the global system, as well as potential conflicts across a number of fronts. Look at the climate or ecological stresses. We have rising global temperatures, ocean warming, sea level rise, biodiversity loss. We have concerns around multilateralism and whether or not those systems are failing us in this moment. There's rising geopolitical competition and how that extends to countries' interests in the polar regions. There's a scramble for resources that's been driven by national and economic security imperatives and shifting and evolving national priorities. And we're seeing that here in the United States across the board. And so in the face of all those challenges, there's an awareness of the importance of the Antarctic region, our need to protect it, and to ensure that there are governance structures around Antarctica that are strong and meet this moment and into the future. And so that was the motivation behind today's conversation, to come together to increase understanding of what's happening in Antarctica, the treaty system itself, the conservation agenda that underpins so much of the work there, to talk a little bit about the dynamics that are driving and limiting some of the progress in those spaces, whether that's environmental or scientific or security related, and then look a little bit into the future and consider how we work together to achieve our collective objectives. So really thrilled to be able to have this discussion today and this panel of experts who have deep experience and expertise on various dimensions of these challenges playing out in Antarctica. So in terms of the format today, I'll introduce the panelists and ask them some questions, and then turn over to the audience for questions. Those of you in the room, we'll have handheld mics. For those of you online, please feel free to ask your questions throughout the time, and we will be able to field those when that period comes together. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists and get the conversation started. So to my immediate left, we have already called out Dr. Benjamin Gadan. He's newly minted as the Senior Fellow and Director of the Stimson Center's Latin America program, also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins. He is a Latin America scholar and previously served as Director of Latin American Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's also served in government as the South America Director on the National Security Council at the Department of State and Department of Treasury. He's also worked as a journalist in the past. Next to him, we have Evan Bloom, who wears several hats these days, including as the Marine Protected Area Policy Advisor to the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, Senior Advisor to the Center for the Ocean and the Arctic at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway. There's a lot of words in all of his titles. He's also had roles at the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies, and he is a lawyer and a former U.S. diplomat who served as director of the Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs, as well as the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Ocean and Fisheries at a time before me. And in those roles, he was the head of the U.S. delegations to the Antarctic meetings for almost 15 years and led 4 official inspections of foreign facilities in Antarctica. And last but not least, we have Mallory Stewart, who is the Executive Vice President of the Council on Strategic Risks. She recently served as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability at the State Department, following other stints at the State Department in the past, including as an attorney advisor in the Office of the Legal Advisor. She's had roles at Sandia National Laboratories, the Stimson Center, Georgetown, and has deep expertise across a number of topics, including weapons of mass destruction, law and policy, missile defense, outer space security policy, and risk management regarding emerging and disruptive technologies. We were going to be joined by an additional panelist who has had an emergency come up, and so she's unable to join today, but we're looking to try to capture her feedback and thoughts in some way on the Stimson website sometime soon. So. All right, that's enough for me, a lot of talking, and turning over to our panelists. One of the reasons we wanted to have this event this week was because the CAMLR meeting, which happened in Hobart over the last 2 years, 2 weeks concluded, and thought that was a good moment in time to spark this conversation here in DC. Evan was just spent the last 2 weeks at those meetings and has been, again, working for decades within the Antarctic Treaty system from inside and outside of the government. So Evan, thought we might start with you and just explain a little bit about what CAMLR is and how it's set up to address the environmental issues and where do we see progress and challenges within that system.
So, Mal, thank you very much, and thank you to the Stimson Center for having me and us here for this. It's really great in Washington when there's an opportunity to talk about Antarctica. Coming from the former Wilson Center Polar Institute, which was and intended to be bipolar, still the people tended in this town to be more interested in the Arctic side of things. But Antarctica is important for U.S. policy and for U.S. interests as well, and so it's great that the Stimson Center has put this panel together. So yes, I've only been back for like a day and a half from Hobart, Tasmania. It was my 17th trip to Hobart. So I've been going to these meetings of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources for a long time, and 15 of those were as head of the U.S. delegation. And now I'm on the NGO delegation tasked with working on trying to set up new marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean. So spent 2 weeks. This is always a 2-week meeting held in October in Hobart, Tasmania, as Australia is the host for this convention. And the focus of CAMLR, so the Antarctic Treaty system is constituted by a series of interlocking legal instruments, one of which is the Antarctic Treaty, but also the Environmental Protocol, as you've mentioned, plus this thing called CAMLR. And this commission focuses on marine conservation and fisheries management in the vast Southern Ocean, which is, in the context of CAMLR, south of 60 degrees south latitude, and a little more to account for the Antarctic convergence. So it's a vast area, and they try to focus on conservation issues and not just fisheries management. But over the past years, even though they have successfully worked on trying to apply science to fisheries management and conservation. There has been a pronounced focus on marine protected areas. And since 2002, the Commission where the Commission made a commitment to try to establish a network of marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean. And now 2 such MPAs have been created, one of which is the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, which is the world's largest MPA, and that was established in 2016. And this was based on a proposal by the US and New Zealand, and is kind of and still is the world's largest high seas MPA, and the key example for going forward in various aspects of international oceans policy, including acting as a kind of influence for the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, which was agreed at the UN a couple of years ago. But getting back to CAMLR, as you may know, since 2016, when the Ross Sea MPA was established, the China and Russia in particular have had a kind of buyer's remorse, it seems, about MPAs. Now, the Antarctic Treaty bodies act by consensus, strict consensus, which means that you have to have all of the countries agree in order to make progress on anything, which makes it quite difficult to proceed. So the stars aligned in 2016, but since then, Russia and China have been putting the brakes on. And the question was, at this meeting, could we make progress on one or more MPAs? And there are 4 proposals that have been fully developed, have all the science behind them, all the details worked out, which could move forward in this context. One of which, called the Domain 1 proposal, which has been put forward by Argentina and Chile, is sort of at the forefront now of whether this can move forward. And it's been linked to another issue related to krill management. So sorry if I'm getting into too much, well, a lot of detail here. But basically, there has been a real focus on krill over the past months because for the first time, something called the trigger level. So there's a certain level for fishing for krill that had never been reached before. But for various reasons, that was reached, particularly because of increased fishing by China and Norway in this area that's near where the MPA would be placed. And so this has created a real concern about whether the krill is being managed correctly within the Antarctic context. And krill is the basis of the food chain, lowest part of the food chain, and key to the entire ecosystem. So in CAMLR, over the last 2 weeks, the question was, how do we deal with this aspect of krill management, and how does it relate to the MPAs? And there were 3 basic issues. One was 3 basic approaches. One, several countries wanted to increase the level of krill fishing. That's one aspect. Another aspect was spatial management, because now, because of certain regulations have lapsed, it means that a lot of krill fishing can be concentrated in particular areas. And that's not sustainable, it's not precautionary, and pretty much everybody agrees that that's a problem. And then, what do you do about this Domain 1 MPA? And countries like Argentina and Chile, with support from EU and New Zealand and some others, were saying, we are not willing to increase the level of krill fishing unless we agree to this MPA. So all of that, sorry for all this detail, comes together in one big mass. And 2 weeks of negotiation led to absolutely nothing. in the end, there was no agreement on any of those issues. And so we can discuss why that is the case. But it was good that some countries stood strongly in favor of conservation and strongly in favor of the MPAs, and not allowing the MPAs to be undermined, which is, I think, a key moment. But I think I'll stop there, but that's what's going on in CAMLR.
Great. Well, not so great if no progress is being made, but I think that's a good overview of just kind of the tensions at play there, and especially given the system and its basis in consensus just generally. So thank you for that. I think people like myself from the science community often think about Antarctica from a science or an environmental perspective, but it was signed during the Cold War, and that means that it is truly an arms control treaty. And so, Mallory, you have knowledge of treaties and national security and arms control, and curious to know if you can help people understand sort of the treaty and what is like verification, compliance, what does all of that mean in the context of this particular treaty, and how does that work on the ground?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here at Stimson. It's nice to be back and to be on this distinguished panel. Very honored. So thank you for asking me that question. I have to admit that this seems like a safe space, that the Antarctic Treaty is one of my favorites because it was one of the original arms control treaties, right? Article 1 prohibits any measures of military nature. Article 5 prohibits any nuclear explosion. Article 7 sets up this amazing inspection regime to a certain degree, though I think regime is putting it broadly, because the participants in the Antarctic Treaty have access anywhere at any time to any of the facilities or any of the locations in the Antarctica, and also vessels and other sort of outposting of those that are utilizing Antarctica. That is amazing because we have no other arms control treaty that, one, hasn't been violated since its creation, and two, has an inspection regime for anywhere, anytime, no notice. So that's exciting for me as someone who sort of prides myself on loving arms control, though that is also, this is a safe space, so I'll say that in this context. The Arms Control Treaty, the Antarctic Treaty really represents a grand ambition to reflect the peaceful and scientific nature that those negotiating it really wanted to maintain in the Antarctica. And I think in the Antarctic, and I think the challenge that we see now is that the rest of the world's problems are catching up with this peaceful treaty. The construct that were so optimistically laid out for a very bare bones inspection capacity, anywhere, anytime, and for definitions in the treaty that weren't clarified. Any activities of a military nature, any nuclear explosion, and having an ability to really look at other people's facilities was a very grand ambition. The challenge is these days, one of the biggest military uses potentially of happening in the Antarctic is of a dual-use nature, right? So we have military personnel down there because those are often the most capable, the best capacities. It has the science and researchers, but also the ability to work in extreme environment. Manning stations that sort of receive and provide and sort of detect and utilize satellites, right? There's a pure environment in the Antarctic to actually have a clear access to satellite communications, to instruct satellites, to receive information from satellites. And it reflects something that was not even anticipated during the Cold War, which is here is a facility that's manned by military personnel that's talking to satellites. And we are assuming, because that's the commitment in the treaty, that it's all for peaceful purposes and science. But we cannot be sure. And this is where I think the Antarctica is really at a crossroads, to reflect the title of this panel. The rest of the world is going to impact this treaty significantly as we move forward. in any dual-use context, and we see this in emerging technologies across arms control treaties, across all treaties, you won't be able to intuit intent by outside observation. So think of the challenges of the Biological Weapons Convention. Many times the countries involved say, no, this is for peaceful purposes. We have a biological agent to investigate our potential vaccine capacity. And you just really have to take them at their word. It's very hard to tell what the utilization is of that biological agent. And in this context, in the Antarctic, we have a similar challenge, and it's a growing one, because we have the geopolitical struggles that we've seen on the rise, as we all are aware. Countries are operating in an environment of less trust. In fact, in the arms control arena, the US government has been very clear there are no remaining arms control treaties that haven't been violated. I would obviously put the footnote here of the Antarctic Treaty, but that has not been at the forefront of people's radar. So we're in an environment where there's an extreme lack of trust. There's dual-use capacities and military staffing in a scientific facility that's utilizing software. Is it for a military purpose? It's very hard to tell. Is it enhancing our capacity to detect what other satellites are doing, to interfere with those satellites, to potentially target those satellites in some way? We don't know. And what we've seen in the recent years is a rise in the questions regarding what is going on in these facilities. We've seen China and Russia establish, and even China especially, but Russia also more recently, establish an even greater presence in the Antarctic. We've seen an ability potentially to raise even more questions, right? There was a story that Evan and I were just talking about before the panel about Russia having made a landing strip a little more difficult to utilize, potentially to offset an ability to have an inspection. This is, again, is it urban legend, Antarctica legend? I mean, this was not something that either of us were involved in, but there's growing rumors of distrust and potential misuse of Antarctic facilities, and I think that's where we really have to focus some of our concern in the treaty support arena, to make sure this doesn't degrade the treaty and to make sure it doesn't provide an excuse for others to take actions inconsistent with the treaty, because it's a trajectory that we're very familiar with in the arms control arena. One country assumes or thinks it has information, or actually has information of potential violation on the part of another country. There's no way to enforce, and I'll talk about very quickly the inspection sort of process and the challenges of enforcement. But before I get there, we've seen countries challenge other countries' behavior, you know, and there's sort of a back and forth of distrust and even potential allegations before the treaty is withdrawn from in some way, or the treaty becomes less meaningful and potentially less adhered to. And so that's what we should try to avoid in this context, and really understand how we could potentially support an inspection regime, how we can support an environment for the treaty that leads to more trust and less questions. And so very quickly, Article 7 sets up this inspection regime by the participants, where they at any time can go into another facility and inspect. Now that inspection is loose, right, because we don't really have clear definitions. There's a checklist of things that you should sort of look for. It's a very long checklist, and actually Evan is probably pretty familiar with it. But it doesn't say, go into the computer, determine if that terminal provides military significant information for a weapons program, right? It doesn't give that capacity to the inspectors. They wouldn't really even know what to look for. So the inspection regimes allow other countries to come in with no notice, but out of courtesy. Usually a day and a half or so is provided, and in an extreme environment such as the Antarctic, it's very, very rare that you'd be able to sneak up on someone, right? It's not a realistic expectation to just think you can pop up and nobody knew you were coming. But you go in, you look around, you take notes, you try to determine sort of if anything is out of place, if anything seems more militaristic. I think another sort of question on verification could be, are any of these scientific and research projects being used for economic gain? Are they trying to sort of utilize drill technology for non-scientific purposes? Because all of that would be implications for violations either of the Madrid Protocol or the Antarctic Treaty itself. We have to figure out a way to make this process at least somewhat more transparent or more robust. What has been pointed out, actually interestingly, by a Chinese colleague in January of this year, and something that I think in general we can all agree with, is that there's a lack of enforcement capability for these inspections, right? That they sometimes raise concerns and nothing happens. Even the US has had allegations from other countries about our environmental practices, maybe our sewage management or our waste control, and very little consequences stem from those questions. And so here we see an inspection regime that's toothless. And of course, we have a legitimate concern to make it toothful, because then it could be used in this geostrategic competition against each other. Challenge inspections is a well-known threat that once you start the process, governments can use it against each other, raising difficulties, and again, by using an inspection mechanism too aggressively or raising too many questions, again, degrade the treaty itself. So we have challenges from all sides, not just the dual-use nature, but the ability to use the inspection mechanism itself. I will just, one last point is just say that if we can raise some of the transparency available, if we actually utilize this 2012 set up this electronic information exchange system to provide all of the dual use military equipment that's coming in, supposedly to affirm that it's for peaceful purposes, to provide the expertise and technologies that could be dual use, to provide that they're in there for the scientific purposes, not the military uses. If we could try to make that a little bit more transparent and build it up, and allow for some ability to coordinate and cooperate on these inspections so that many different countries can be involved, they can discuss their concerns together. There's ways to strengthen it. We just have to be very careful that we don't turn this into a tool for the geopolitical challenges or the ability to pull out of the treaty, which some countries may at some point want to do. Thank you.
That's super helpful. And I think just thinking about how the correlation between this and what we're learning in the arms control space and other dual-use spaces is a really interesting sort of idea there. Inspections are a major topic that of a lot of interest of people in general. And so just before we turn to Ben, I wanted to ask Evan, because he's actually been on inspections before, some of the things that Mallory raised around this intent and how do you understand what the actual equipment is and how it's being used. Curious to know if you just have any insights from your boots on the ground or on the snow or on the ice experience on that.
Yeah, so I tend to think of the inspections as being one of the most important and valuable parts of the Antarctic Treaty and Antarctic Treaty system. The inspections are called for not only under the Antarctic Treaty, but under the Environmental Protocol. And the U.S. has seen value in them over the past decades, and in fact has carried out more inspections than any other country. The reason that inspections aren't carried out often is it's very expensive to get around in Antarctica. I think they cost $500,000 or more, depending on where you're going. And so take a lot of planning and preparation. So in any event, the U.S. was doing them at a clip of like once every 5 years or so, but that's a lot more than other countries. I would say that I wouldn't see ultimately the inspections as being toothless, in the sense that it kind of depends on what you're looking for and what you expect to find. So we don't expect to find armament, because the demilitarization of Antarctica, which was mentioned already, works pretty well under the Antarctic Treaty system. So if one did expect that, there would be a different kind of inspection protocol, I think. These days, it's more a question of whether you're going to find violation of environmental rules. And there you do find things worth reporting. And in that sense, you sometimes will find things that you bring back to Antarctic Treaty meetings and you present it to the other treaty parties. Sometimes that those conclusions are welcomed by the parties that are being inspected, and sometimes less welcome. But I think it does cause a change in behavior for most of the inspected parties. Once something has been revealed, they tend to address it over time. Whether they admit the extent to which they're doing that is a different sort of issue. The dual use problem is a very complex one, and I think you make a very important point about how difficult it is to tell when you show up at a station what the use of particular technology is being put to, and is something being put towards a military use or not. And if you go and you see that there is an antenna there, the inspection team is probably not going to be able to figure out how exactly that is being used. But there may be other ways of a government assessing that and thinking that through and making the inspection regime even more useful to countries like the US and others that are focused on geopolitical and national security concerns, and the physical inspection is one piece of that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. So bring Ben into the conversation a bit, because I think we're talking about the treaty and the multilateral elements, but the reality is nation states have to develop their priorities for what they're thinking about the region, how they're showing up in these spaces and in these meetings. And so, countries in Latin America, two of them are quite close to the continent, and they're not just members of the treaty, Chile and Argentina, but they also they have claims on the continent that were made before the treaty was signed. They're also gateway cities, meaning that in order to get down to Antarctica, you have to go through 5 different gateway cities, essentially, 2 of which are in Latin America. So curious to get your thoughts just as a scholar on how the dynamics of all of that play out into thinking about their thoughts on Antarctica.
Yeah, so first I'd echo Evan's remark that those of us who follow South America are often jealous while the attention paid to the Arctic. Mm-hmm. So it is nice whenever the Antarctic is a subject of some conversation and debate. Evan's, of course, been a loyal follower of Antarctica issues, but it's not the same with other scholars of the poles. I would say, for Argentina and Chile in particular, the Antarctic is a real part of national identity. Not only are there territorial claims, but there's the geography, right? It's just 500 miles or so from the southern tip of Chile. It's relatively close. Punta Arenas in Chile, Ushuaia in Argentina. There's a whole economy based around the housing of international scientific ships, but also individuals and institutions that have their regional headquarters there. There's a tourism economy, for better or worse, given the risks of over-tourism, but it does generate economic activity in these otherwise remote regions where there's not a ton of other economic engines. And then beyond that, on the substance, they have been real players, both of those countries, as members of the treaty community, and in particular on the marine conservation piece. Evan mentioned the Argentine-Chilean proposal for a Southern Ocean marine protected area. They didn't just design it and do, I think, what's considered a pretty good job, but they've been real drivers of the debate in promoting it. These are not countries that are always major players in globally significant discussions, but on this, I think they have really played an essential role in keeping this conversation alive when there's been just total paralysis on marine protection under the treaty instruments. And I think they take great pride in that as well, and justifiably so. And that's been true in other areas. Chile in the High Seas Treaty that Evan referenced, it has asked to be the secretariat in Valparaíso. It was, I think, the second country that ratified this agreement. And this is another example of Chile, arguably punching above its weight on an issue of global environmental conservation concern. And then, they have a lot of scientific investment there as well. And, they do it despite the logistics and the great expense, they do it at, world-class level and generate a lot of really valuable science. And I should mention that Uruguay and Brazil also have scientists that are there, and great national investment in making sure to produce earth science and climate science in Antarctica. So regionally, it looms large, and these countries care about it. They care about their voice in global decision making with regards to Antarctica. They care about generating science. It's an economic engine. So even, again, beyond the territorial claims and historic connections, they really are relevant players there. And I appreciate the question, and I appreciate their perspective being a part of the conversation. Sometimes it can be overlooked because, again, they're somewhat peripheral powers on so many global issues. That's just not the case when it comes to Antarctica.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. So, there are, we already talked a little bit about some of the claims and the rumors, and those swirl quite a bit around Antarctica. I think one of the ones that I heard oftentimes in my last position was like, isn't the Antarctic Treaty going to expire soon? There's this date of 2048 that people throw around as a moment where things might shift in the system. And so I'm turning to Evan, if you can explain a little bit about what this rumor is about, what happens in 2048, how do we think about that moment?
Yeah, so in the media, it's often said that the treaty is going to expire in 2048, and this is because of a misunderstanding of a rather complicated set of provisions in the environmental protocol. And basically, the deal is, when the environmental protocol was negotiated in the 90s, a provision was put in it that said that the protocol should be reviewed 50 years after it enters into force, and that's 2048. The fact that it might be reviewed or not reviewed is something that could happen to any treaty, but so there's a clause that says that you could call for a review conference. That doesn't necessarily mean that the protocol would change. With respect to the mining ban, so Article 7 says that you can't have mineral resource activities in Antarctica, which means no mining and no going after oil drilling, that sort of thing. That binds all of the parties, and I would say is the most important environmental provision in the entire Antarctic package of Antarctic Treaty system contracts or treaties. So it is possible for a country to say they want the mining ban to end in 2048, and then there would have to be a discussion leading to 3/4 of the countries deciding that they would not wish to do that, but you'd have to replace it per the provisions of this, per the provision in this treaty, with a regime that it has equivalent level of protection. Now, what all that means, I'm not entirely sure, but you would basically need a huge number of countries to want to back out of this. So that is by no means the ending of the treaty. It's by no means an ending of the mining ban. It's, in any event, more complicated than that.
Great. Thank you for level setting on reality on that, and see how those conversations continue to evolve. As we are thinking about sort of all of that is much more in ways in the security agenda. We talked about a little bit of the environmental agenda. We've talked about marine protected areas. Again, all of these are trade-offs and things that are sort of priorities in different spaces and in different ways for countries, for us as like a global community. I think oftentimes think about the conservation agenda in marine protected areas as somewhat distinct sometimes from, again, all of these other things that are happening or all of these other priorities that countries have in the more security space. But I'm curious if folks in the panel just open it up on how you could make a case for the marine protected areas and the conservation agenda rising to a level of priority amongst governments as you think about our broader strategic objectives generally. So curious to know if who has some thoughts there.
I mean, I guess I would just briefly say that kind of paradoxically, it is, countries like Chile and Argentina that may be more effective drivers of that than some of the larger players in the conversation. And we've already heard that the Russians and Chinese come in with great skepticism of whether greater protections are desirable. The United States might or might not anymore have an interest in it, but certainly it has very little leverage when it comes to moving Russia and China in this context. And countries like Chile actually maintain pretty good relationships with both, right? Certainly with China and with the United States, and so might be able to drive those kind of sensitive negotiations and trade-offs in a way that's more effective than the United States and some other maybe Western European members could. And so I think we've already talked about their commitment, and I think they actually have not only the motivation and scientific knowledge and evidence about the importance of marine protection and the krill fishery, but also the diplomatic relationships and skill that could be really useful here. And I think in some ways the United States historically has underutilized that in thinking through its strategy to break this deadlock.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think there has to be an acknowledgement, putting aside some of the political approaches to the environment in various countries, including the United States, that the Antarctic provides, as Evan put it, the first step in many environmental sort of either food chains or processes in terms of water temperature, in terms of environmental temperature, and recognizing that scientists actually were surprised by some of the environmental changes reflects that we don't know everything. And so if there could be a prioritization potentially for the economic future of the world that relies on all of those, I think it's hard to say the world in these contexts because every country is looking out for its own interests. But if there was a way to sort of maximize the scientific coordination that still exists in the Antarctic region, and to say, regardless of a politicized environmental awareness, we should all acknowledge the economic dependence and the true sort of strategic reliance we have on this arena, and we should try to preserve that.
So I guess I'd add that in Antarctic governance, the MPA issue is arguably the most important policy issue going on in the Antarctic Treaty system. There are other important ones, including regulation of tourism and dual use and other issues that we've already talked about. But in terms of sort of front rank policy, the MPA focus is really important. And that's why when Chile and Argentina in particular stood up actively to China and Norway and others who were saying, well, let's raise the krill catch, but we're not so much concerned with the MPAs. It took great fortitude on their part to stand up and say, no, we're not going to handle it that way. And it was very impressive what they did in particular in Hobart over the last couple of weeks. But MPAs are really important, and they're not just important in the Antarctic context, but they're important internationally. And we can see that in this high seas BB&J treaty, where area-based management tools, which are what MPAs are called in that context, were a key element of that treaty. And the key existing example for large-scale MPAs comes from CAMLR, from that Ross Sea MPA. So that was the example that countries had in mind when they negotiated the BB&J treaty. That treaty now has the correct number of ratifications to enter into force in January of the coming year, and so will be an engine for creating MPAs. But in order to have the sort of the process of science-based MPAs move forward, you need organizations like CAMLR to be showing the way. And that's why continuing to push forward in the Southern Ocean context is particularly important. But also, I'd say, because if you can't do it in the Southern Ocean, where can you do it? Because there are more limited economic and political problems in that area of the world that should make it easier to establish MPAs. I mean, how are you going to do it in the middle of the Mediterranean, for example? the thought is, if you can do it in and achieve what's called 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030, Antarctica, again, should be the place that leads the way.
Great. Thank you for those thoughts. And just to pick up on the sort of science collaboration piece of it, I think the foundations of the treaty were really, in some ways, driven by a group of scientists who were pushing governments to create, again, a more robust system for increased scientific exploration back in 1957. It was as a result of something the scientific community put together called the International Geophysical Year. And so there have now been four different international geophysical years and international polar years. And we're coming up on the fifth one, which will be from 2032 to 2033. And so I think the international science community is really rallying around sort of the planning for this particular year, and do wonder if there's an opportunity there for some of these conversations to come together for, again, sort of the science to help to drive some of the objectives that we have on the continent and in our planet, but also maybe vice versa. So just wanted to throw that out there as well. I think the last question that I have, sort of before we turn over to questions in the room, we've already talked about the Arctic a bit and the Antarctic. I think it's another thing that continues to come up in these conversations are, how much are the issues that are in the Antarctic and the Arctic the same? What are the differences? Some people say it's, as we think about the geopolitical tensions and all of the things that are driving our interest in the Arctic, that should be the same as the Antarctic or that region in general. So curious to know, for whoever wants to take it, sort of how do you see the differences and the similarities of what's happening in our north and southern poles? And I might ask, Evan, I know you spoke a lot, but you have the titles that are all Arctic, Antarctic, so I feel like you're uniquely positioned to maybe lead on that one.
Because I'm bipolar. I get it.
Yeah.
It's a good question. The Arctic and Antarctic governance are related but significantly different. So from my point of view, when you look at the Arctic, you think of the organizing principle being that it's the Arctic Ocean surrounded by land, but most of the places within the Arctic are covered by domestic law and domestic jurisdiction. Then the central area is law of the sea, and in terms of shipping and all of that, it's UNCLOS and law of the sea. But it's different on the other side of the world, where you have a continent which, despite the fact there are 7 countries that have claims to territory, basically, and certainly from a U.S. point of view, is owned by no one and is governed pursuant to the treaties that we have been talking about. So it's an international collaboration in terms of governance for the purpose of peace and science pursuant to these treaties. And it's substantially, as we've talked about, demilitarized effectively per the Antarctic Treaty. Whereas in the Arctic, it's not demilitarized at all, in fact, quite the opposite. So very different regimes. You don't have an overall treaty for the Arctic, but those are basic principles.
Great. If anyone else has thoughts? No, that's totally fine. We are open now to questions in the room and online. There's a few online, but we'll give the folks in the room an opportunity to answer questions first. And I see a hand in the back and then in the front. If you can just introduce yourself, and we will take your question now.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm a retired high-tech industry executive, ComSat, IBM, VeriSign, companies like that. And for those of us who don't follow this a lot but recognize that it's important, I think there are 2 things that might help clarify among people who understand this. First is this whole notion of territorial claims and disputed territorial claims and unrecognized territorial claims. I can't think of anything else I can compare it to But if there is such a thing as a territorial claim to the Antarctic continent, why couldn't Panama simply claim the entire continent? Why couldn't some country just claim? And I was sort of shocked when I looked at the list of countries. Norway, which is like on the other side of the world, claims that part of the Antarctic is Norwegian territory. So if you all could explain this very confusing aspect of it. And secondly, just beneath the surface, I think, is the issue of what military value could this piece of land have. And it's been generally presumed that it has absolutely no possible ever military value, but I don't know if that's true or not. Is this is a big piece of land and between a lot of countries, maybe there is a military subtext to this whole thing. So the two topics would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Evan, if you want to take the first, and then Mallory maybe the second.
Right. So in terms of territorial claims, it is sort of an anomaly at this point that you have claims having that sort of significance in Antarctica. But basically, at 1959, when the Antarctic Treaty was signed, there were 7 countries that had formally come forward with claims. The U.S. was thinking about it but hadn't done it. And 2 countries that at that time asserted a basis of claim, which are the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so in Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty, this reality was taken into account in a pretty interesting way. And what the Article 4 does is it sets aside the claims. It holds them in abeyance. So they're not done away with, but the countries with claims say that they will cooperate with others and conduct science, but anything done by any country after 1959 doesn't count towards helping the claims or undercutting the claims. So in effect, it kind of freezes them in place. So the position of the U.S., which is none of the claims are valid, continues, and the position of the UK and Argentina and Chile and the Antarctic Peninsula that they own it continues, but they're not going to do anything about it. And that has been really effective in terms of allowing for cooperation. So in the example of Panama, which is a non-party, I suppose they could claim anything they wanted to, but I think that would simply be ignored. The U.S. right is theoretically there, but in order to promote that right, the U.S. would have to leave the treaty, and probably the U.S. would not wish to do that. Same thing for Russia.
And I think the most relevant right now for some of the concerns about dual use capabilities are infrared telescopes, GPS, and other ground station receivers that can communicate most effectively in the Antarctic because of its environmental sort of unique environment, right? So less moisture in the environment, a direct shot without significant light pollution, just a challenge across the board in other arenas that are not present for some of these equipment and these dual use capabilities. And then when you talk about the arms race in outer space, which is very real, and the fact that the outer space arena is being militarized and there are weapon systems now either on Earth or in space that countries are working on. Here's a location that's pristine that allows you to communicate extraordinarily effectively and perhaps even target other satellites. So you have a fear that that capacity is being used for military weapon systems either in space or on Earth. And all of our militaries rely so extensively on communication through those satellites, as you know. And so all of that fear is wrapped up in a, what if we don't have the best position on the continent? What if others have a better position and exclude our capacity to use it? It's both, location, which is everything, but also capacity enhancement.
Great. And just because one of the online questions kind of picks up a little bit on your last point, Evan, I think one of the questions is sort of a diplomatic tool the U.S. government has used during treaty negotiations is to threaten to withdraw. It's typically a last resort, but can make a difference in pushing negotiations forward. So the question is, what's holding the Antarctic Treaty together in the face of potential threats of withdrawal?
Well, first of all, I haven't heard any country threatening to withdraw, which I think is a good thing overall. One of the great things about the Antarctic Treaty and its interlocking set of instruments is that it's kept the peace in Antarctica for more than 50 years. And how many instruments can you think of that have effectively done that? So it's a good thing for the U.S. to not have to worry about conflict in that area. So that's one reason that I think you don't want withdrawal from the treaty. But countries like the US, China, Russia have national security interests in that part of the globe, and they are being balanced through a number of factors, including presence through their stations, but not through military bases and all of that. So that demilitarization in particular is I think is an extremely good thing for all of these countries, because imagine how much you'd have to invest if you wanted to protect territory. If, for example, Australia, which has a claim to 43% of Antarctica, again, not recognized by the US, but if Australia was called upon to protect militarily that area, which currently has Chinese stations in it, for example, it would be kind of a disaster. So you don't want to have a situation like that. It's much better to have the current regime where you don't have military presence and you have countries cooperating.
I mean, I'll just add, I think that in discussions on this in the past, the question of, would we want to open up the treaty or leave it, I think there's a general sense that you're never going to get anything better than what's there. What's there is strong, and it is all about how do you reinforce the parts where you can have increased compliance and make sure that it's robust versus, throwing it away or leaving it in general. It's not in anyone's interest. Great. We had one question up here in the front.
Test. Grant Turner with the Stimson Center. I kind of want to build on what's been said, but in terms of a longer, 50, 100-year time horizon, how long till, assuming the worst case scenario with climate change, large portions become much more habitable? And what does that security landscape look like? To your point about the treaties, I'd be curious, has war or conflict been avoided because of the treaty, or because the cost benefit hasn't been there with the current, literal climate? So just be curious to hear your thoughts about that in the bigger picture.
I will definitely leave to the scientists exact sort of timing on how long. I think actually the scientists have been surprised in the Antarctic just as recently as this most recent polar ice cap dissolving faster than expected. I will say I would like to credit the treaty with doing a lot of it, but I think you're right to point out that maybe it just wasn't economically sort of, the balance didn't work out for geopolitical conflict. As the rise of, conflict across the world is increasing competition for resources, increasing competition, for food sources and for, maritime resources as well, especially as we find more and more stories about the massive quantities of oil that is buried, or the massive sort of resources that are being not tapped because of the treaty, I think the treaty would be more and more challenged. And that sort of goes to your point, that environmental degradation is one element that's going to challenge the treaty, but I think the fight and the strive and the competition for resources is another element, and either of those or both of them together can cause a tipping point that we can't even predict. Hopefully, we're able to prevent that, but I would say those are the two most significant risks.
I guess I'd add that I totally agree that competition for resources it kind of goes to the heart of this. I think the treaty is helped, but as conditions in the world change, you can imagine that there would be pressure on one or more countries, including perhaps non-parties to the treaty, wanting to do something down there. The treaty system has already faced this in one respect because prior to the mining ban that's in the environmental protocol was the negotiation of a treaty that would have allowed mining on the basis of a regulatory regime. And that was a treaty that was actually signed by the US and others. And due to the leaders of France and Australia in particular, they said, and it had, as you recall, you need to have unanimity, consensus, in order to do anything. They said, we don't think the right answer for Antarctica is mining under regulation. We'd rather have no mining at all. So that caused the negotiation of the environmental protocol. But so it was an earlier time when most countries thought that they wanted to actually conduct mining in Antarctica. I think that what this change that was led, again, by Australia and France was an extremely positive step in protecting the Antarctic environment. And I think most people these days would say that this was the much better approach to take. But can you imagine a world in which they find something in Antarctica and some particular minerals are desperately needed and something, you know, I hope that doesn't come because it's much better for the environment, this largely pristine area, to remain the way it is now.
Maybe I just add, I think you're right to point out that kind of reckless global environmental policy is impacting the ice in Antarctica. It also, in parallel, though, is increasing the appreciation for natural spaces, those few that remain, and biodiversity protection, right? And so we've already talked about the rich marine life. It isn't just krill, but, you know, penguins and whales, and, you know, it's an entire ecosystem that really has been protected, and the same thing even without the same levels of ice. So ideally, you know, that would be a motivator to double down on conservation in that part of the world. And for the countries in South America that are closest to Antarctica, again, that has long been the priority, really across ideological shifts, right? This has been, you know, 5 or 6 decades. There's been a lot of pendular swings in countries like Argentina and Chile. But issues of conservation and climate tend not to be very partisan in that part of the world. You know, Chile is a classic example of this, where you had a conservative president who established a new, you know, climate observatory, including a lot of additional sensors in Antarctica. You currently have a far-left president of Chile. One of his first big trips was to the South Pole. And, you know, this was, I think, a really clear symbolic representation of that kind of continuity of policy when it comes to conservation, when it comes to managing Antarctica.
And maybe I might ask just one question, Evan, to you, because climate change is something that is addressed generally in the CAMLR context. I'm just curious to know what those conversations, how does it come up in the CAMLR context, and how are the parties trying to navigate the potential future end state?
So the Antarctica is key for science related to climate change. And the thing that the Antarctic Treaty and CAMLR can do is to promote climate science that helps scientists throughout the planet understand climate. And the IPCC, for example, has been influenced by work that goes on at both poles. So both bodies, the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting and CAMLR, have focused both on promoting climate science, but also in the CAMLR context, trying to take into account climate change on changes in the fisheries. So now, whether it always does so successfully, I mean, I am not so sure. And some delegations are more focused on that than others. But I think there has been a sense within the treaty system that climate change is important. I think the U.S. is not emphasizing that issue quite as much in the Antarctic context anymore, but other countries are and continue to ask their scientists in Antarctica to work on those issues.
Great, thank you. I think I saw a hand in the back and then one here. Maybe we'll take both of those questions and allow the panelists to answer them, and then we'll switch back to the online questions. So one there and then in the front.
Hello, my name is Yash Desai. I'm a first-year graduate student at Hopkins, and I study security and governance in the Arctic. So it's good to hear about the other side of the world. My question is about energy and critical mineral extractions. So you've talked about the fact that the treaty bans it on the land, that's Antarctica, but how does it deal with offshore projects? So my question is two-parted. One, are conditions in the Southern Ocean conducive to such projects? And if so, how does the law of the sea, those domains, the marine domains, extend for Antarctica? And how does that and the provisions within the Antarctic Treaty then work for offshore projects?
Great. And then up in the front.
Yeah, Anders Beal with the Stimson Center. This is a really great discussion. I have two questions. One is on funding for scientific research in Antarctica and how that helps to either degrade the treaty with a lack of funding for scientific research, or how it helps to strengthen research and collaboration amongst different research stations and countries, because I'm assuming that some level of joint research occurs across countries. It's not just one research station doing this. And historically, the State Department has had a predominant role, but so has the National Science Foundation, which has experienced cuts in the current administration. And I'm wondering how that helps or hurts kind of the U.S. approach to science diplomacy and soft power in this part of the world. And also, just as a second question, the year 2048, what does that mean for the treaty, and what does it not mean in terms of kind of some levels of misinformation going that, you know, that's the date where essentially countries could pull out, or that it won't be, you know, the treaty could be weakened at that point, given the earlier question about kind of long-term trends and protections related to climate change.
Great. So,
You want me to take the first one?
sure.
So I think I'll, just in legal terms, in terms of where these protections apply. So it applies to the entire area south of 60 degrees south latitude, which means that entire area of the Southern Ocean plus the land mass. So mining is prohibited on land, but also in that area of the Southern Ocean. So it's all one piece.
Great. I mean, I can take a stab at the funding question. Yeah, I'm not a U.S. government budget expert, but the money that sustains the Antarctic program does flow through the National Science Foundation. So there are parts of the budget that go to research, there's parts that go to education, there's parts that go to infrastructure. And so I think the FY26 presidential budget changes some of the levels of all of those things, but it looks like the infrastructure piece seems to be, at least the proposal, to be pretty consistent. I think research might go down, which will impact our universities more, I would say, but the support to sustain the things like even like inspections has to flow through the National Science Foundation. So if there is less funding given to this, that will be a challenge fundamentally. I will say that the administration has highlighted that the relevance of the scientific program for their priorities, strategic priorities in Antarctica. Every year, OSCP and OMDB put out a budget memo that helped to outline what our research priorities are as the U.S. government. In the last iteration of that, they discuss, there's a line that says that the dominant presence of the United States in Antarctica under the treaty is expressed through a world-class science program. Agencies should maintain and where feasible, strengthen Antarctic research infrastructure. So that is a statement that this administration has made. I think the question is, what does that actually look like with dollars and where things go? On the 2048, I don't know, we talked a little bit about that, and I don't know if anyone.
Maybe if I could
can
just
add more.
quickly add on the funding question, is that, yeah, the research that's done by, non-US scientists, I think as we've discussed, is hugely valuable to the United States because it, tells us a story about the impacts of climate change that, couldn't be more urgently needed across the globe. Brazilian scientists, and Argentine scientists in recent years have detected some of these climate anomalies that have exceeded projections in ways that really reverberated and helped, both scientific community and policymakers understand what's happening at the poles. And again, so to the extent that there is fewer resources available to those scientists as well, it would make a difference and a negative one.
And I would just add just a two-finger on that, which is, to your soft power point, the absence of scientific research or projects going on means we would need less presence in Antarctica in general. And as China and others are doing more and more research, they have justified then more presence, right? And I think it's a very basic point, but it's one in which if the Antarctic Treaty is going to be challenged, or if there's going to be capacity to lead decision-making, the more presence you have there, the more science that you're deriving from, it gives you a little bit of an edge in the conversations between the governments involved, because you have this bigger presence, you're doing more work there, and maybe the concerns that we have for strategic purposes are going to be exacerbated if we don't have as strong a seat at the table, or if there's more bases or more facilities being utilized by other countries and we're not utilizing our facilities and letting them fall into disarray. And I think it's sort of soft power on the one hand, but also heightened insecurity on the other hand if we're not there, if we're not in the conversation.
So if I may, I agree
Sure.
with what my fellow panelists have said completely, but also I'll add that the U.S. has, since the Antarctic Treaty was signed, has been considered the leading country in Antarctica. It had the most scientists, the most people, the largest station, the only station at the South Pole. We have the most tourists who go there. Very strong American interest there. And American interests are expressed through, and it's sort of unique in the world, through capacity for science and carrying out science. And so if we cut back on the science, there is this question of whether we will ultimately cut back on our influence. So certainly Chinese presence is rising, but from what I can understand, they haven't reached our level yet in terms of their capacity for logistics and the number of people at stations and all of that. But if we continue to cut back on science, it does raise the question of whether the U.S. will continue to be the leading country in Antarctica. And for people who care about that, well, the science, plays a part in figuring that out.
Yes, I fully concur with all of that. All right, one question online, since we're talking about the U.S., I think just continuing on the thread of bringing it back to sort of the Antarctic Treaty system in Kamilar. But, how has the U.S. role changed in recent periods? And is this, measurably, does it impact the confidence in the system, the effectiveness? Is it really, could it be attributed to sort of a shift in multilateralism more generally? I think, Evan, you're probably positioned to answer this the best, but, the trend of the U.S. role and influence in the system over time, curious if you could comment on that.
So I've attended the Antarctic Treaty meetings last couple of years as well as Kamilar. I would say that with the Trump administration coming back in, by and large, the contours of U.S. policy has not changed dramatically. There's always this question of whether, the shift in terms of emphasis on climate change or the amount of research, of course, that has a certain effect. But in terms of positions taken in these diplomatic bodies, I think there hasn't been a huge shift, and certainly not particularly different from the last Trump administration. So I think one needs to be cautious in simply assuming that U.S. positions have changed overall with respect to Antarctica. Probably more important is the level of funding for Antarctic logistics and science, but that's different about positions taken in those bodies.
Great. And Evan, you're in the hot seat on these questions, so apologize that many of them are directly in your lane. But we've mentioned the BB&J Treaty, the High Seas Treaty, really, I think, one of the shining moments of success in multilateralism in this moment, I will say. But how and in what ways will BB&J interact with CAMLR?
So I was the head of the U.S. delegation negotiating the BB&J Treaty at the UN for a while, but not in the final stages of it. And in the final text of the BB&J Treaty, it gave a lot of the final responsibility for MPAs in particular to regional bodies, as opposed to the BB&J Conference of the Parties. And what that means is that organizations like CAMLR will continue to play the key and probably determinative role when it comes to establishment of MPAs within their jurisdiction. So I think CAMLR will still be the place where marine conservation is focused and carried out, not the BB&J Treaty. Now, at some point, the BB&J Treaty may try to influence not only Antarctica, but the Arctic Ocean and other sort of places, or make recommendations. But since CAMLR has jurisdiction, I think that they will continue to be the ones to have the final word.
Great. Well, we have exhausted our time for questions, but thank you for all of you who asked them. I think they helped to round out a lot of the topics in the discussion today. I might give the panelists, if they want one more minute to say anything before I close things off. Maybe you'll start on Mallory and then go this way.
Just that we should celebrate the Antarctic Treaty. We should be very happy that it has been in existence. It has kept a situation that could have been challenging. It has kept it peaceful for so long, and I think we should continue to support it and see how we can strengthen it and hopefully prevent its diminishment.
I certainly agree with all of that. There are great things about the Antarctic Treaty system that are in, I think, the U.S. national interest in particular. Antarctic diplomacy at the same time can be extremely frustrating because of this consensus rule. Getting anything done or advancing anything is extremely difficult. At the same time, the things that the treaty system accomplishes, including large-scale protection of the environment and demilitarization, as we've talked about, is a really good thing. So and I'm really happy that Stimson Center has decided to focus on those issues today.
Great.
I guess I'd end where I began, which is to say that promoting a leadership role for some of the particularly South American countries that are part of this system is not a way for the United States to give less attention, but actually would be a strategic investment of U.S. diplomacy in empowering countries that share a lot of U.S. objectives when it comes to the conservation agenda, and might have some unique ability to actually move this long delayed, paralyzed conversation about marine protection. And so, yeah, my pitch would be to let countries like Chile, Argentina, even Brazil, which have the right geostrategic positioning, to continue and to play an even more enhanced role in some of these discussions.
Thank you, all of you, for your expertise. This was a wonderful discussion, and as we envision this, bringing all of your expertise to bear really helped to shape this event. So thank you very much. Just say that, I think the strategic investment is a great way to end it. I think that there is a real need to continue to think about how we're putting together all of the pieces and coming up with a holistic approach as national governments through the international treaty system to really be able to ensure that the continent is secure in the future, as is our sort of ability to work together and address all of the conflicts and the challenges as they arise. So I am grateful to be able to have moderated this conversation, and thank you all for coming. Great.